Deeptika Lauren joins us now for a look at the main stories around the world. The man behind those tax cuts, Deepti, the U.S. President Donald Trump, and the Chinese press had glowing reviews about his visit to China.
Very, very sparkling reviews indeed. Let's start with the China Daily, which says Sino-U.S. ties are at a new historic starting point. That's what they say euphorically on their front page, dedicating quite a few pages to that summit between China and the U.S., as well as Donald Trump and Xi Jinping's respective wives. The two leaders struck a quote, upbeat, cooperative tone, with both men agreeing to work on a number of issues. In its editorial, the paper says there's still a lot of work to do, but there's a, quote, boundless potential for growth, while another state-run paper called the Global Times says Sino-U.S. ties are becoming more mature after the summit.
Was the press outside of China as enthusiastic?
Not at all. We're really getting the other side of the spectrum there. Peter Brooks, let's start with this cartoon from Peter Brooks, the cartoonist for the British daily The Times, who's got his own take on the visit with Donald Trump's wandering tie. While the South China Morning Post, which is a Hong Kong-based paper, says they're focusing really on his welcome in Asia in general, saying the Japanese Premier Shinzo Abe played golf with Donald Trump, while in South Korea, I quote, a gaggle of children greeted him like he was Asia's Justin Bieber. But this is all strategic, according to the South China Morning Post, because finally, after months of uncertainty, Asian leaders have finally figured out how to play Trump, and that's through flattery, which in this case will get you everywhere with Donald Trump.
Okay. Well, let's move on now to the magazine Time, which has featured Emmanuel Macron on its front cover this week. The French president talks about a whole host of personal and political issues.
Well, the cover is making a lot of buzz online, notably for, you might see here, the positioning of Emmanuel Macron's head that covers the M and looks like there are devil horns on his head. So many people have been focusing on this.
It could be cat ears.
Or cat ears, red cat ears maybe. And also the headline on the Time cover, which calls him the next leader of Europe, but with a caveat, the little asterisk there, if he can figure out how to lead France first. The other thing people are obviously pointing out are those ears, but in the interview, Macron really does address a whole host of personal and private issues, like his relationship with Brigitte Macron, his wife, and his fractious relationship with Donald Trump. Under Macron, Time says France could emerge a far more important global power than it has been, but if he fails, the far right could return in force in France. And the thing is, we won't know the power of Macron for some years to come.
All right, well, let's go to Australia now, where an Iranian-born senator has been racially abused in a Melbourne pub.
Well, that attack took place at a university bar where Sam Dastyari, who is that senator, and another fellow senator from the left-wing Labour Party a group of men called him, among other things, a terrorist and a monkey, and told him to go back from where he came from. They then posted the video on Facebook calling themselves patriots, and one Australian newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, has decided to name and shame one of those attackers. This man here was one of the men involved in that racial attack. They call him True Blue Zero, True Blue being Aussie slang for a real Australian thing. In this case, this does not represent Australia. And in fact, the incident has provoked a national discourse on Australia and its attitude towards racism. One writer for another paper, the Sydney Morning Herald, says these incidents happen all the time to a whole bunch of different people. The only difference this time is that it was put in the public domain for everyone to see.
All right, and speaking of diversity and race, a new editor of British Vogue is making waves for a diverse and inclusive first edition under his tutelage.
A historic edition, that's what the Independent, a British daily, says. Edward Enninful has been lauded for ushering in a new era of diversity. The latest issue of British Vogue features Adwoa Aboa, who is a British Ghanaian model and activist. Also an interview with London Mayor Sadiq Khan. Enninful, who is the first black male editor of Vogue, says his Vogue will be all about diversity of race, gender, class, and body types.
All right, and finally, another step in the right direction, some might say, is a new college course being taught at the University of Pennsylvania. Tell us more.
It's called Monks for a Month, and the idea is that students in this course have to give up their cell phones and computers for a whole month.
This is at college.
This is at college. And not only that, they have to stop speaking altogether, not just in class, but at home, in other places. The idea is not to speak for a whole month. They can only communicate via shock horror written letters. And the professor who runs this course is actually a specialist of Buddhism. He says he's discovered that kids find it surprisingly easy to actually give up technology. The hard part, though, is the fear of missing out on things, FOMO, essentially. The things that, the idea that they're missing out on opportunities to meet people, to do things, to hang out, and basically avoid being lonely. On the flip side, they've rediscovered things like live music, theater, and museums. And surprisingly, students are clamoring to get into this course.
I can't keep up with all these acronyms. FOMO, YOLO. The point is unplug and get out there,
That's
right? Diptyka Laurent with a roundup of the international press. Stick around, more news, more headlines coming up in just a moment.